Hello everyone! I hope you all had fun virtually camping with us yesterday. Thank you for joining us today again for the second day of our 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. My name is Jessie Redmond and I will be your host. On your screen you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you are not familiar with our webinars or did not join us yesterday, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. We love getting questions and do capture all throughout the session, so we'll answer some during the live webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer, we will address via email. In the Related Content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which is filled with thousands of educational resources, and also links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful if you'd like to learn more about the certain topics discussed today. We will also point these out to you throughout today's presentation. You will also notice under the slide area and next to the Related Content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout today's sessions to understand at what point these topics fit into the overall third-party risk management process. Today's live sessions are eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all polling questions that appear on your screen during each session's presentation. You will also be sent a survey link 24 hours after the live bootcamp has concluded on Friday, October 4th, that will also need to be completed in order to receive the credit. We hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. We covered the difference between criticality and risk ratings, steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy, critical vendor contracts, and an overview of fourth and nth party vendors. Today, we're going to cover vendor cybersecurity posture, vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program, assessing vendor SOC reports, and lastly, managing AI risk with third-party risk management. For the next hour, we will be joined by VenMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa May Hill, who will discuss your vendor's cybersecurity posture and vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Lisa May Hill will be back to discuss vendor SOC reports and reviewing findings and next steps. After that, Hillary Dewhurst, VenMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will join us to discuss how to manage AI risk with third-party risk management. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessie. We have so much to cover in these 4 agenda items, so we're going to jump right in. But we're going to talk about cybersecurity posture at our vendors, what to review from your vendors, some data breaches, stats, tips, best practices, and then, of course, key takeaways. And let's just get started. So when we talk about understanding your vendor's cybersecurity posture, what we're really saying is that you want to make sure that your vendors are prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue. So part of that is ensuring that you're determining that your vendor is keeping your data as well as your customers' data secure and safe. And you want to make sure that you're reviewing if your vendor is prepared to prevent an attack with policy and procedure, detect an attack with technology, and then respond, right? And all of those pieces are critical. And for the most part, we follow the CIA information security triad when we talk about cybersecurity. And so it's a great place to start, and it's really just making sure that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data or your customers is protected at all times through that vendor relationship. This is just a quick reference slide to the CIA information security triad. The CIA triad is really the foundation of cybersecurity. It talks about confidentiality, integrity, and availability being the 3 points that are really critical when setting up cybersecurity programs and areas to address. So when we're talking about cybersecurity and understanding why it's important, and the bottom line is that understanding your vendor's cybersecurity posture enables you to influence the vendor to either strengthen their controls, influence your leadership and organization to supplement your vendor's controls with controls of your own, and then make decisions on whether you should be staying with that vendor. Understanding their posture allows you to make sure there's alignment and have the clear expectations on both sides. It's also hot button for regulators, for those of you in an industry that is really overseen by strong regulation. You have to demonstrate that you're taking proactive steps to identify and mitigate potential areas of weakness with your vendors, not just yourself. So ultimately, in most scenarios, you're expected to cover that CIA information security triad. So we say this all the time too, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. I think this is very prevalent in third-party risk management, vendor management. The reality is that you can have the most robust security controls in place, but if your vendors are weak, then you are weak. And industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all the potential ramifications that are posed by third parties. And so that could be anything from a data breach to a business disruption. So you want to be taking that into account. And again, you could have the best programs in place known to man. If they don't, or at least align with yours, then it's a moot point. And from a planning standpoint, you really need to consider all of the possible problems that can occur, right? You have to be proactive in your approach. And then, understanding from your vendor's perspective how long it would take them to get back up and resuming normal operations is also going to have a huge impact on you. So that domino effect is real, right? If they have a problem, then you have a problem. Cybersecurity can be really intimidating, especially if it's not your chosen field or a field that you're super familiar with. And so I just want to try to break it down kind of into 4 areas that I consider critical to review when we're talking about what should I ask my vendors for. And if you focus on these 4 areas, at least initially, you'll get a good understanding of where they stand on areas that are really critical. So those 4 areas are going to be security testing, how they treat sensitive data security, what they do, employee, contractor, and vendor management, and then incident detection and response. And we throw in there too, cybersecurity insurance coverage, which we'll talk a little bit about. One of the first critical elements is security testing. And when we talk about security testing, we're not talking about you testing your vendors. We're talking about you reviewing what type of internal and external security testing they do on themselves. So best practice is you want to see some third-party testing. And this is things like internal and external vulnerability testing, penetration testing, and social engineering testing and awareness. And the reason that testing is such a great indicator of how a vendor is doing cybersecurity or what their posture is because it gives you tangible insight into their systems, right, and how they react to issues, how do they mitigate risks if they're found, and you really want to see regular intervals of testing. Best practice for things like penetration testing is annually. If you're seeing that they don't do it but every 5 years, that's a problem. And so part of understanding what you're looking for is understanding the gaps as well. So you want to make sure that when you're reviewing their security testing documentation, you're really understanding what you should be seeing so that you can identify what's missing or what doesn't appear to be best practice. The next critical element to be reviewing is sensitive data security. And so if your vendors are having access to or processing any type of sensitive data, you need to make sure that they are putting in proper protections against any type of unintended disclosure or unauthorized access or unwanted actions. The way to do this is to verify that the vendor is taking precautions. Things like encryption, and is it up-to-date encryption? Is it for data at rest as well as data in transit? And then data retention and destruction policies are very important, as well as their data classification and privacy policies. And this is another area where you want to make sure you understand what you're looking at so that you can identify the gaps, because if they don't have the correct types of policies and procedures in place, or they're not using the right encryption, you want to make sure that you have a solid understanding of what you would expect to see in these areas as well. The third critical element is going to be employer, contractor, and vendor management. I think we are all on the same page at this point that our weakest link are our users, right? So you want to make sure that your vendor has the ability to ensure that their employees, their contractors and vendors, which are your fourth parties, are prepared to protect data that's crucial to their overall cybersecurity, whether it's yours or theirs. So things like pre-contract vendor due diligence and ongoing vendor monitoring. Is their vendor management plan as robust as yours when it comes to the passing of data? Security training. We talked a couple slides ago about security testing, and I mentioned social engineering tests. This goes hand in hand with security awareness training for employees and contractors. Background checks. If they have employees that have access to sensitive information, are they the appropriate employees? Do they have the right checks in place to make sure that they're hiring the right type of individual? And then, of course, access management policies. You want to make sure that they're robust, they're up to date, they take into consideration both onboarding and termination of employees, contractors, and vendors. So last but not least, when we're talking about critical elements, incident detection and response, and of course, cybersecurity insurance coverage. An incident can be anything, right? We know that that could be anything from a breach to a minor incident. It's anything that's going to affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an information or information system. And so vendors have to have a plan in place to address that, right? They have to make sure that their plan is quick and efficient, and that it allows for an end-to-end response to any type of incident. So everything from the moment it's detected to the moment it's resolved, and any types of remediations that need to be put in place to prevent it moving forward, lessons learned, etc. That needs to be covered in their detection and response procedures. And then, of course, insurance coverage. We know that insurance is not a substitute for security, but we do want to make sure that our vendors are at least taking security serious enough that they have some type of policy in place, depending on the size and maturity of their program. So understanding the different types of coverages that are available and making sure that when it's appropriate, they have it in place. So on these next few slides, we just have some lists of documents that you can request. So this is a little list of legal and procedural documents. These are things we talked about in the previous slide, but just like a little cheat sheet for you to have of different documents that you can request as you're doing these types of assessments. These are some specific policy documents to request. A lot of organizations have one primary information security policy with a lot of different sub-policies within it. So you just want to make sure that you're seeing these kinds of policies in place and that they are aligning with what you would expect them to contain. Here are some planning documents you can ask for. Oftentimes, these types of things in business continuity and disaster recovery plans should include testing results as well. And you really want to make sure, regardless of what document you're asking for and you're looking at, that you know what you're reading. You want to make sure that you're understanding the content so that you can not only make sure that it's checking all the boxes, but that you can identify gaps if there are any. So making sure you understand what you're asking for and reading is really critical when we're talking about document collection and review.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first poll is, do you currently look at cybersecurity policies, procedures, and test results as part of your third-party risk management process? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Lisa, we have some time now to answer a question that is coming from the audience. And that question is, what should I ask about when it comes to incident response? Is it enough if they have a plan, or should I ask if it has certain things in it?
That's a really great question. And you know, a lot of times when we are looking at cybersecurity information, vendors will send over like a table of contents of their policies and procedures, or they'll answer a questionnaire and just say yes. And you know, is it enough? No, it's not. You really do want to understand what's in those policies, right? Now, you know, understandably, in some scenarios, that's the best that you're going to get, and so you have to just kind of evaluate the risks that that presents. But when we're talking about incident response, you want to make sure that their policy has the identification of an incident, the response to that incident, and then, you know, what happens after, right? Like, is there a mitigation that happens? Do they evaluate? What's the notification process? So you want to make sure that their incident management and their incident response go hand in hand. And then, you know, one thing that I also recommend that we kind of get laughed at a little bit sometimes for saying is there a paper copy? You know, in this electronic age, in this digital age, you really do need to make sure that these incident responses are available in paper, hard copy format, because if your system goes down, you need the ability to have that at the ready. So, I mean, you know, we could get into more details about what you should look for, but the reality is having it isn't enough. You want to understand and make sure that it's comprehensive.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. You may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, in the Related Content widget, you can find our Vendor Cybersecurity and Privacy Compliance, Key Regulations and Tips to Know infographic. Back to you, Lisa.
I think we're all in agreement and on the same page that data breaches are on the rise. They continue to increase, and frankly, hackers are getting more creative. We know that anybody is susceptible to an incident or breach because we're seeing more and more large companies that are in the security industry are even being breached. So hackers don't discriminate when they're looking for an asset to attack, and so the common theme, I think the takeaway is it's not if, it's when. So to grab a real-life example, you know, we can talk about the Snowflake breach really briefly. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think we're all pretty familiar with a lot of these recent breaches that happened. And ultimately, you know, the feedback on this was that organizations that were impacted didn't have multi-factor authentication in place for their Snowflake accounts. And I think the takeaway there is that we recognize that understanding our vendors' controls and then what we have to do to complement them is critical. So we have to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, especially when we're talking about access management, and then what we need to do to complement that. This is just a stat slide. I always like to include these, but also know that as quick as these slides are created, there have been more incidents and breaches. And so even though these are very recent, there's been even some larger ones more recently. So the link at the bottom of the slide is a great resource. So I encourage you to go and check it out. It's very up-to-date information on breaches throughout the year. Now that I've scared you with all of the breach information, I just want to reiterate the idea that it's not if, it's truly when. We know that incidents and breaches are going to happen. So trying to understand, how to best protect yourself, your reputation, and your customers is really critical, both with your vendors as well as internally. And we're going to talk about each of these in the next few slides. But the reason that we say that you want to make sure that you are proactively approaching cybersecurity is because there are huge repercussions to a breach, right? Even if it's not your fault. There's going to be increased regulatory scrutiny. There's possible fines and other monetary impacts. That loss of customer confidence and reputational damage are often just really big pieces of our success moving forward. So we're going to jump to the next couple of slides, and we'll talk about each one of these things, both internally and externally, what you should do if you've been breached. So we're going to jump now into the 10 best practices when handling a data breach. A lot of these are themes throughout this presentation. So, be transparent. Acknowledging a breach is a painful exercise. Nobody wants to do it. But I can assure you that the mistrust and reputational damage that's caused when organizations don't notify their clients or customers as soon as humanly possible is far worse. And that's why things like ensuring data breach notification requirements in your contract language, that proactive approach is so crucial because, ultimately you want to make sure that if something does happen or when it happens, you're notified as soon as possible because you'll then have to turn around and do the same thing, which is number 3, ensure that you tell the appropriate people, right? So be transparent with the clients and customers, ensure that you have the most time on your hands as humanly possible because you're going to have to tell the appropriate people as well. And this can be state AG, law enforcement, regulators, it depends on the industry you're in. And then understanding how you'll notify them is also very important. So the next thing is define the impact of that breach. You want to make sure that you know what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to one individual's data? Did it impact a lot of customers? Did it impact certain customers? Did it just impact you as the organization? Making sure you understand the impact is crucial. You want to make sure that you're throwing water on the right area of the fire. And then, of course, adopt that customer notification process. It's not enough to just say, we'll notify in 72 hours. You need to understand how that works. How are you going to do that? It's best to notify impacted customers directly. You don't want them to get it from the news. And then, of course, offer credit monitoring services. This is a great way to put some faith back into your relationship with your consumers or customers. And, where that's appropriate, it just depends on the relationship. But it is a good way to help kind of get their faith back in you. After the dust has settled, you really want to then take kind of an internal look, right? So do you need to implement more robust user authentication procedures? I think, going back to that Snowflake example, this is a great question that you want to ask yourself, both at times of incidents, but also at renewal periods, right? Are you using the best, most robust user authentication procedures for the data being processed, handled, viewed? And then you want to perform your own root cause analysis of that breach or incident, right? So your vendor is going to do the same, but you want to make sure that you can do it internally as well and say, okay, do we agree with this? Was there anything that could have been done differently or we would have expected to see done differently? Lightning does strike twice. And so you want to make sure that you're learning from that breach and building a stronger information security system internally, as well as ensuring that your vendor is doing the same. And then lastly, we touched on this a little bit before when we talked about breach notifications and contracts. You have to set expectations with your vendors. Vendors are much more able to provide you what you need if you tell them on the onset of that relationship or at those renewal periods, this is what I expect to do this year. This is what I need to do this year. These are the kinds of documents that I want. I can tell you from my interactions with many vendors that it is very helpful for them to know up front what type of assessments you would want to be doing and what type of evidence you want to see. And then, of course, again, turning that lens internally, you need to make sure that at the same time and rigor that you're putting into assessing your vendor's cybersecurity, that you're doing the same to your own information security processes and cybersecurity processes. And make sure that you're documenting all of the updates. Make sure you're doing refresher training for employees. Cybersecurity, information security is not one and done. It has to be done annually from a review and education perspective. I won't continue to beat a dead horse by going through this whole slide, but this is just a list of different things that you can proactively put into your vendor contracts that can just help you protect yourself when you're talking about doing that cybersecurity due diligence and letting vendors know upfront what it is that you need from them. Okay, so just to wrap up this portion of the boot camp for today, just some quick key takeaways. Number one, include the right to audit language in your contracts. Only share sensitive data when necessary. Make sure that you are giving the bare minimum to those who absolutely need it. Ask for everything you need up front. Again, that proactive approach with your vendor just goes a long way. And you want to make sure you know who to review and when, and that you have the right people doing those reviews. We talked about that at the beginning. Identifying gaps is just as important as making sure that they're doing certain things. And then understand what data you're trying to protect. You want to make sure that you know what you have in order to make sure that it's being protected properly. Number 7, of course, always include breach notification language in your contracts. And you want to make sure that you're also prepared with your own breach notification plan, not just who, but how. And then last but not least, again, be as proactive as you can, but be ready to be reactive. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to hand it back to Jessie for a few minutes, and I will see you again for the next session.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that informative session. If you found this session valuable and are interested in learning more about the topic, please be aware that you can find standalone sessions available at venminder.com/webinar or by clicking the webinars link in the related content widget. In our webinar library, you'll find our upcoming webinar, Understanding the Elements of Your Vendor's Cybersecurity Program, that is at the end of the month. This standalone session will go into even more detail about vendor cybersecurity programs. Lisa will now discuss vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessie. We're going to roll right into business continuity and disaster recovery, and we're going to just talk about what to look for on those plans, what to review, and then incorporating cybersecurity into that business continuity management, really taking what we talked about in those previous slides and how do they go together with business continuity. So let's just jump right in. So what exactly is business continuity management, or BCM? It's really an umbrella term. It encompasses everything from business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning. Business continuity management really is about incorporating proactive measures to mitigate disruptive events and evaluate an organization's ability to recover, their recovery capabilities. It really provides direct insight into how availability, availability from that CIA triad, how availability is protected and ensured, and it allows for you and your vendors to proactively plan for disasters and business interruptions. It's going to help you, your organization, protect from data loss, regardless of if an incident is with your vendor or internally. It gives you that assurance that that you can then turn to your customers that your product and service is always going to be available to them. So I get asked all the time, what's the difference between business continuity and disaster recovery? They obviously go hand in hand, and business continuity is really a proactive approach to ensuring that business functions can continue at a full or predetermined and accepted level of availability after an issue or an incident. Disaster recovery is a subset of that, and it outlines the process and the procedures in place that you would follow immediately after an incident up to and including the resumption of normal operations. So business continuity is proactive, disaster recovery is often reactive, and then you do this for your own internal organizations. But you should also be validating and aware of what your vendor is doing in these same areas. This is just a quick slide on business continuity and disaster recovery terminology. These are pretty common terms: business impact analysis, or BIA, recovery time objective, or RTO, recovery point objective, or RPO, and maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. We'll talk about these things throughout the rest of the presentation. So I think sometimes where business continuity gets tricky is whether you put on the lens of you're looking at your own business continuity as an organization versus reviewing your vendor's business continuity. And so I think the first step is doing that business impact analysis with your internal lens to ask yourself about your vendors. Would a sudden loss of this vendor cause a material disruption to my organization? Would that sudden loss of this vendor impact our customers? Would the time to recover operations exceed 24 hours? And would there be a negative impact to operations if it did? What is the RTO and RPO for them, and does it align to us? And so you're taking that BIA process that you've probably used internally for your own business continuity and turned it onto the vendor relationship to identify what the impact is from a business perspective if they have a loss or an incident. So I think when we ask ourselves, why is this important? It aligns very much with cybersecurity in saying that, well, would your third party survive in the face of a disruption? And if the answer to that is no, what is the impact to you as the business receiving the services from that vendor? So if your BIA shows that your organization can't operate effectively if a particular vendor is unavailable, then your third-party risk management program should include thoroughly evaluating the vendor's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. If availability of that vendor is critical, then you have to understand what their business continuity and disaster recovery is. You have to understand the procedures that they have in place to handle that business impacting event, and it has to align with yours. And this is just going to allow you to be aware of the downtimes, right? What could affect your operation and reputation? Are there downtimes acceptable to you? And then you can plan accordingly with your own business continuity and disaster recovery. So what should a BIA include? Critical business functions and systems, like things like infrastructure dependencies, support systems, any type of business interrelationships need to be analyzed. Workflows, organizational charts, all of those things need to be reviewed as part of the BIA. And then an interdependency analysis conducted by management is going to identify single points of failure in close geographic proximity, which can help you proactively approach business continuity with your vendors. So this is my own little acronym that I like to use when we're talking about availability and business continuity when trying to figure out, who do I need to really be looking at, and it's ICE. So identify your vendors and their product and service. This could also include your fourth and end parties, right? And then characterize those vendors. What are your critical vendors? Do they source outside themselves to service you? That kind of helps you identify any fourth parties that need to be in this process. And then, of course, evaluate your vendor's business continuity posture and their response to disruptions. So when you're talking about the risks to availability and business continuity, when you're doing that BIA and you say, yep, this vendor, if they go down, I'm going to be in big trouble, that's when you flip to this ICE, identify, characterize, evaluate.
Our second poll question of the day is, do you perform a BIA within your own organization? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, I have another question here from the audience that we could go ahead and answer while we wait. And that question is it okay if it's all just one big plan, like disaster recovery and business continuity and pandemic is all covered in one plan?
Thanks, Jesse. That's a good question too. I mean, I think a lot of times what you're going to find is that your disaster recovery, business continuity, and pandemic are all covered in one program, right? They should have individual plans. Now, do they need to be individual documents? I don't know that that matters at this point, but what you want to make sure that you're seeing is that there is a specific start and end process for disaster recovery and testing, same for business continuity, and same for pandemic, right? Because I think we've all learned that pandemic especially needs to have its own process and procedure to make sure that organizations are really focused on the right steps in a very specific scenario. And then, you know, disaster recovery and business continuity go hand in hand. They are together. They should be a part of each other. And disaster recovery is a component of your overall business continuity. So it's not unusual to see them all together in one business continuity program. But you do just want to make sure that the vendor is demonstrating clear process and procedure for each kind of domain, right? So disaster recovery needs to be attacked in a different way than business resumption, and same thing with pandemic. So they do go together. It's okay if they're all in one document, but they really do need to have some specific pieces that are individualized for each scenario.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our vendor cybersecurity elements to include in business continuity and disaster recovery plans ebook and the related content widget. This is a handy resource to grab as it contains information on what cyber elements you should be including in your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Lisa, let's continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Jesse. And so now, you know, rolling back in, we're going to kind of talk about cybersecurity, which we talked about in the first presentation, and business continuity and disaster recovery, and how they go together, right? You know, traditionally, they've been two very separate programs. And, you know, the reality is that they're very intricately linked together because IT networks and systems are essential to business continuity, right, especially today. So they need to work together to protect data and streamline the responses to any type of disruption. Because really an incident can be anything from a breach to the most minor incident that you can think of. And so in today's business landscape, cyber attacks are a serious threat, as we know. So it's critical to have measures in place to protect your organization, both from tornadoes as well as cyber incidents. When we talk about incorporating cybersecurity into the BCDR plans, really what we want to look for is, are our vendors considering cybersecurity disruptions as part of their business continuity and disaster recovery plans? So, and then really emphasizing on protection, prevention, recovery, and threat detection. And so as long as they are looking at it through that same lens, then I think you can move forward with incorporating those cybersecurity reviews along with those business continuity and disaster recovery reviews. Like any type of disrupting event, a cybersecurity incident, it can have detrimental effects on your organization's financial health, reputation, customers. So your policies need to be coordinated effectively with your vendors, both for cybersecurity and business continuity and disaster recovery. So now we're just going to talk about 5 best practices for incorporating cybersecurity into business continuity management. And we'll go through each of these in the next slides, but we're going to start with number 1, take a proactive approach. So I think the common theme in both of these presentations today is really the idea of a proactive approach, right? So when dealing with disruptions, you want to make sure that you're not focusing solely on the reactive, because even though we know it's going to happen at some point in our business lives, you want to be proactive to mitigate the impact, right? So if it does happen, what can you put in place proactively to limit the disruption, limit the impact of the incident? And these are going to be, things that go along with our own business continuity and disaster recovery plans, as well as our own cybersecurity plans. And there are a lot of the same, themes that we had in the first presentation. Determine who's responsible for specific actions. Limit access to information. Make sure that cybersecurity provisions are in your contract with SLAs. Make sure that your contracts require your vendors to maintain effective business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Incorporate vendor due diligence reviews. And then inventory the data and services that your vendor controls. You need to know what you need to protect. So just like in your cybersecurity, you want to make sure your vendor's breach notification policy is being reviewed and that it's detailed in the business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You have to understand what they plan to do and make sure it aligns with what you expect them to do. You want to make sure that RTOs related to a cyber attack are included in business continuity and disaster recovery plans, and make sure that you know what your vendors' RTOs are as well. They need to align. You can't only prepare for natural disasters, and neither can your vendor. The RTO is going to depend on the severity and type of attack, which systems are compromised. And so it's just really important that you're defining those requirements and that they are aligning. Number 4 is to back up your data and define your RPOs. When it comes to managing your data, you can't rely on a single network. It's necessary to back up on a regular basis, right? And you have to make sure that that aligns with your vendors as well. To recover your operations from attacks, you have to have an offline backup of your data. Hackers continually discover new ways to steal and compromise data, so backing it up gives you that peace of mind in a case of attack, and that plays heavily into your RPOs. So ensuring that your vendor is doing the same and has that same alignment with your backup schedules and your RPOs is going to be critical if they're backing up any of your data or your customers' data. Just a couple more points on backup. You want to make sure that backups are encrypted at rest and in transit. The details around how your organizations and vendors accomplish this should be included in BCDR plans. And again, I think I said this on the previous slide, but determine that RPO. It's just critical to make sure that you have documented what amount of data loss is acceptable for you in order to resume normal operations, and make sure that aligns with what your vendor is promising to deliver back. And then, of course, last but not least, perform ongoing monitoring. Ongoing monitoring is critical, I think, in almost all areas of third-party risk management. It's just the idea that none of this stuff is one and done. So making sure that you're monitoring your vendor's performance throughout the relationship is essential. And if availability is a critical control for you, then making sure that you are doing regular cadence reviews of their business continuity, disaster recovery, and cybersecurity.
Our next poll question is, does your organization look for alignment between your business continuity and disaster recovery plans and your critical vendors plans? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question that's come in. And this one is, what if the vendor says their RTO and RPO are confidential or they don't have actual numbers?
Well, that's a good one. And I think a lot of times we want to just try to put our feet in our vendor's shoes, because from my perspective, my initial gut response is RTO and RPO are not confidential. That's just silly. But at the same time, I think vendors come to the table with, look, this is our information. Why do you need it? You know, we're not just going to hand out the keys to our castle just because you think you need it for due diligence. And so I think there's a lot of back and forth there. Now, that being said, your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, the numeric value that goes along with those RTOs and RPOs really shouldn't be considered confidential with your clients as long as you have the proper NDAs and such signed, because that's your vendor's way of saying, this is what we can guarantee you, right? And you need that information to say, okay, this is going to work for us. So I think proactively you need to set the tone that that's information that is required for you to be making decisions and setting up your own business continuity and disaster recovery plans, because you need to understand what they can provide, especially for your critical vendors. Now, if they don't have numbers at all, which I've also seen, and that's not a deal breaker, right? Some people just don't have that information. I suggest you go to the table with what you would expect. What recovery time objectives will work for you in your plans and programs, and same thing with the RPOs, because really you guys have to be in agreement on that. Otherwise, if, God forbid, you know, a incident does occur or a breach occurs, if you're not in alignment over your RTO and RPO expectations and their reality, that can cause a huge issue for you. So if they refuse to give them to you or they refuse to share any of that type of information with you, that is always a red flag. But understanding their perspective, I think, will help you get what you need. So just make sure you're asking the right questions, you're explaining what you're looking for and why you want it, and then proactively try to get that in your contracts.
And here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for answering the question. Just another quick reminder to head on over to the related content widget to grab our Do Your Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans, Consider Your Critical Vendors infographic. In this infographic, you can learn critical vendor elements to include. Lisa, back to you.
So I think we're all familiar with the CrowdStrike outage. Without going into all of the details, I think what CrowdStrike outage did was it really highlighted the importance of adequate business continuity and disaster recovery planning from a vendor relationship perspective, right? Because we saw a huge amount of organizations impacted. And the ones that had robust and adequate business continuity and cybersecurity incident response in place were the ones that were able to kick back up quickly. Or the ones that were able to notify users quickly. And in reality, even those organizations that were able to shut down quickly had some type of response mechanism in place to allow for them to say, wait, something's wrong, we need to close everything down for however long. So I think, you know, there was a lot to learn from the CrowdStrike outage, and ultimately, business continuity and disaster recovery were what that was all about. Some quick key takeaways from this session. You know, ultimately, you have to review your vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery plans regularly, and you need to ensure that you're evaluating availability when deciding who and what to review. We wouldn't expect to do business continuity and disaster recovery reviews on every vendor, but those vendors that availability is a primary concern, definitely need to be a part of that process. Cybersecurity and business continuity disaster recovery go hand in hand. You really need to make sure that you are looking at both as a connected security process, and make sure you're reviewing your vendor's BIA as well as your own and making sure that they align. Ensure you have documented and discussed your breach notification expectations as well as your RTO and RPO, and that it's not a one and done process. It should be ongoing. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to hand it back to Jesse, and I will see you guys after the break.
Thanks so much, Lisa. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, be sure to check out our standalone sessions in our webinar library. Specifically, we have an on-demand webinar covering what you need to know about vendor business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans that might be of interest for anyone wanting a deeper understanding. Before we move on to our next session, where Lisa will discover vendor stock reports, we are going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. We do recommend refreshing your connection at the top of the hour to stay on track with the session. Welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to move into our next session, which is assessing vendor SOC reports, reviewing findings, and next steps. Then my news Lisa Mayhill is back to present this session. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I think we're just going to jump right in. This is a really high-level overview of SOC reports. There's a ton to cover, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So this session on SOC reports is pretty high level. We do have a much more in-depth SOC report webinar that dives into a lot of this a little bit deeper. But really, the very first thing we want to understand is what exactly is a SOC report. And ultimately, the SOC report is a document that was designed to provide information to organizations, the user entities, in three main areas. What controls a vendor has in place to protect their system, what controls you also need to have in place in order for that to function properly, and then it wraps it up with independent testing of those controls that allows you to have a certain level of assurance that the control environment is as it is being presented and that it is adequate. When we talk about when to review SOC reports, I think it's important to remember that it's not a one-and-done activity. Really, SOC reports are appropriate through every phase of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Onboarding, when there's new products, annually, of course, ongoing, situational, when things arise, and of course, as new reports are available. So the key point here is just they're not a one-and-done. When we talk about who should review SOC reports, I think that it's really important to remember that a SOC report is not a checkbox activity. You want to make sure that whomever is reviewing SOC reports on behalf of your organization understands the content of the SOC report, that they understand what should be covered, not just how to read a SOC report, because you want to be able to look at it holistically. This is just a quick list of some certifications that are really helpful for people that are reviewing SOC reports. It's not all-inclusive, they're just the most popular, but they give you a really good baseline when you're talking about the education and the understanding of the SOC report content. And so I say that you want to be an expert in what you're reviewing versus an expert in reviewing SOC reports, because ultimately when you're looking at these SOC reports, you want to make sure that you can not only fill out your checklist of what you expect to see or what you're looking for, but you also want to be able to identify gaps. So depending on the industry, depending on the type of SOC report, depending on the product and vendor, you want to make sure that you can get in there and say, hey, this should be in here and it's missing. And so that's really what I mean by that. Evaluating exceptions and auditor's opinion, gives you a very quick high-level insight into issues, but it doesn't give you the detail that you need. So you want to make sure you're digging deeper than that. As I'm sure most of you know, there are various different kinds of SOC reports. The most common and most often seen being the SOC 1 and SOC 2, which is primarily what we'll talk about today. The SOC 2 Plus and the SOC for Cybersecurity are ones we're seeing more of now. And then the SOC 3 is really a summary of a SOC 2. So we shouldn't really be using that at all for our due diligence, except in the vendor vetting phase. But the SOC 1 and 2 are by far the most popular. This is just a quick overview of the 5 most common sections that you're going to find in a SOC report. We're going to go over each of these at length in the next several slides. But really, sections 1 through 4 are pretty consistent. That's going to be your auditor's letter, your management's assertion. Section 3 is the description of the system. Section 4 is going to be those control objectives and activities along with any testing and results. And then Section 5 is optional. This is where any information that the vendor wanted to share that is unaudited would go. So things like their management's response to exceptions. You see a lot of times business continuity and disaster recovery. And I think actually we're going to jump into our first poll, so I'll turn it back over to Jessie.
This brings us to the first poll after the break. This poll question is, which SOC type do you prefer to get from vendors? SOC 1, SOC 2, doesn't matter, depends on the vendor, or you're not sure. And while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, Lisa, let's answer another question from the audience. And this one is, my vendor only issues SOC 2 Type 1 reports. Is that normal?
That's a great question for this particular poll. So I first want to say that I, present this webinar and am here in my role as an advocate for clients during their due diligence. And I say that because my answer to this may, not be the perfect answer depending on what side of the table you're on. But the reality is that a Type 1 report confirms that controls exist, right? But a Type 2 report validates that they're operating effectively. So a Type 1 report is kind of what I consider a first step maybe for a vendor that's just starting to do SOC audits. So I would not expect to see a Type 1 repeatedly from the same vendor, and I would suggest if that's their go-to, that you understand why they're not doing a SOC 2.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, please be aware that in the related content widget, you'll find our Understanding the Differences Between a Vendor SOC 1, 2, and 3 infographic. As Lisa touched on the different types of SOC reports, be sure to check out this resource to learn even more about each of them. Lisa, back to you.
Okay, let's jump back into it. Thank you for taking a second on that poll question. Right before the poll, we talked about the different sections of a SOC report, and really this slide reiterates that order as part of how to review the vendor SOC report. And ultimately, when you do your review, you're following the order of that SOC report. So this is just, again, that same list, and then we're going to jump into what to look for in each section. When we talk about time frames, there's two types of reports. There's a Type 1 and a Type 2. A Type 1 covers a point in time and really just demonstrates that a control exists. A Type 2 covers a period of time, and that demonstrates that a control is operating effectively. So those are the two types that can fall underneath a SOC 1, a 2, a 2+, etc. And then a bridge or gap letter really should include that SOC report end date and any material changes, if there are any, and it should be for a short period of time just to cover you until that next SOC report becomes available. You should never be accepting a gap letter in lieu of an actual SOC report or to cover a full SOC period. When we're talking about the Independent Service Auditor's report, really, we want to find the opinion in there. The unqualified opinion is what you are expecting to see. That's what you want to see. That's kind of the baseline. Very seldom will you see the word unqualified, but it will basically talk through that everything was as expected and controls work the way that they would expect them to exist or operate effectively, depending. A qualified report means that there was at least one control objective that was not implemented or operating effectively. So that's a flag that you want to follow up on. Disclaimer, this is when there isn't any evidence to prove or disprove that a control was being performed or in place. Again, something that you really want to look into. And an adverse opinion is bad. That's a red flag. They're rare. It basically means that the vendor held back or modified information. So if you see an adverse opinion, that requires some significant follow-up and discussion. We did talk about this a few slides back. The management's assertion is really that attestation from the management of the organization or the vendor, and it really just should describe the service organization system to help the the auditor perform the upcoming audit, and there's certain reasonable assumptions in mind. You do want to read the management's assertion, because if there was any changes or significant things that they want to call out, you'll find them in this letter. So definitely being able to identify that is important. Section 3 is the organization's description of its systems and controls. In this section, you should be able to find the organization administration. So this is going to talk about, the basics of the vendor itself, where they were founded, their location, any management structure. They'll also talk about things like their security training and how they handle policies. Usually sub-services are called out in Section 3. And then they'll kind of go over the products and services. Vendors have a lot of products and services sometimes, and some vendors have a SOC report for every single product and service they have, and some vendors just have one that covers everything. So you do want to make sure that you're honing in on those products and services to ensure that you're looking at the correct report. Also within Section 3 is going to be that description of the vendor's system and any associated controls. Regardless of the SOC type, I'm always looking for controls surrounding the information system, the data center, and then complementary user entity controls. With the information system, you want to look at core infrastructure controls like server security, network management, system management, access management. For the data center, you want to understand, is it a server room? Do they use a subservice? If it's an internal or a vendor-owned data center, what are their physical access controls? Environmental controls are really important. And then, of course, complementary user entity controls are the controls that you're responsible for. So being able to identify those and pull them out from Section 3 is a very important component of your review. Subservice organizations are also generally found in Section 3. These are the organizations that your vendor is calling out as providing critical controls to the operation of their product or service. These are your fourth parties. So you want to understand who they are and then determine if those controls have impact to you so that you can determine at what level you need to review them as your fourth party. They're usually carved out of the SOC report, which just means that their controls are not audited. Sometimes you'll see them in the report as an inclusive review, which means that they were audited alongside the primary vendor. But more often than not, they're using that carve-out method. In Section 4, you're going to now see this narrative come into a testing matrix, right? So this is where the auditor is going to lay out all of those control objectives and activities, any tests that they performed, and then the validation of either their existence if it's a Type 1 or that they're operating effectively if it's a Type 2. This is also where you're going to find exceptions. Exceptions are common, so you want to make sure that you kind of understand what those exceptions are, and then in rare cases, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Those you don't see very often. I think a lot of times when we talk about SOC reports, we hone in on these two main areas, the opinion, which is the very beginning of the report, and then any exceptions that you find in this testing area, this Section 4. And really when we talk about the opinion and exceptions, we want to talk about impact. Do these exceptions directly impact the service provided? Is there a management's response, and is it sufficient? And then are there other controls or procedures in place that give you comfort that the exception doesn't have a high impact? And this is kind of that same area where we talk about gaps, right? So an exception isn't always a deal breaker. It's not always a big red flag, but you have to understand the impact of the exception and then look at that in conjunction with the opinion of the report. Just a really quick note on control design. I just like to always make sure that we understand that the control design of a SOC report, so what's tested, what controls are reviewed, that is all dictated by the vendor. So a SOC report is truly only as good as the vendor that is providing it, right? So the controls can be as robust or as simple or as vague or as informative as the vendor wants them to be. So just always keep that in mind when we're talking about the actual design of a SOC report. And SOC 2s are a little bit better in this vein because there's at least some criteria, the trust service criteria, that they have to be mapped against. So it allows for you a certain level of comfort, but control complexity can vary greatly between vendors. So it's just something to keep in mind. These next couple of slides I'm going to kind of buzz through just because there's so much we could talk about with complementary user entity controls. But basically, complementary user entity controls are the controls that the vendor has included within the system, which you are required to implement as the user of that system. You have to implement them in order for their control objectives to be accomplished. There is regulatory requirements surrounding these depending on which industry you're in, so it's really important to make sure you are identifying these within reports, understanding them, and implementing them. This slide just really reiterates the previous slide, talking about why QEs are important and who needs to be involved. Involvement is based on the type of QE it is, or the complementary user entity control. So that could be anybody from business units to IT and InfoSec staff. You just want to make sure that you're assigning complementary user entity controls to the right people. Lately, we've been seeing a lot of things that are controls that are recommended for a user entity to put in place, but are not complementary user entity controls, so they're not required. So it's important to understand the difference between a QE or a QUE that is required and everything else, which are controls that are recommended. A complementary user entity control is a required control in order for the product or service and security controls of the vendor to operate effectively. A responsibility or anything that is not named as a QE or as a required control are recommended controls to help make the product or service work optimally to give you the best experience. So you just want to make sure that you're understanding the difference. Complementary subservice organization controls, or CSOCs, these are controls related to your fourth-party vendors. So these are controls that your vendor says, hey, our subservice organization is responsible for these areas, these specific controls. They should provide a list within the SOC report, clearly defined what that fourth party does. And it's good for you to know about them, to understand them, because you want to understand the impact to you. If those controls have direct impact to you, it's just helpful to understand that. And it will also help you determine how you want to treat that fourth party. It's very important to understand, though, that complementary user entity controls and CSOCs are different, and just making sure you understand which are which within a report. Okay, so we have gone through all the different parts of a SOC report, all the different things to look at, and then what happens if it's not a great SOC report, right? Ideally, we want everything to look good. We want to make sure that there's no exceptions, that it's a unqualified opinion. But what do you do if it's not, right? I think the first thing you want to do is really look at the vendor's response. Most reports that are negative or have exceptions or a qualified finding are also going to include the management's response to those issues. And these are usually found in that section 5 of the report, or right in section 4 with the testing. Read those, understand their response. Does it add context? Are there other controls in place? If not, if they haven't addressed it in a way that satisfies, then request clarification from that vendor. I think any vendor with an issue on the report is going to expect questions, so ask them. Feel free to reach out to that vendor. I think if you've done those first 2 steps and you're still not fully satisfied, then you have to move on to kind of a reactive approach, which is implementing more robust monitoring. Sometimes it is just what it is. You have to keep a closer eye on that vendor. And then, of course, if that still doesn't get you what you need, then you have to consider modifying or terminating the contract. I mean, ultimately, that's worst case scenario, but the reality is that there may just be times where the issue in the SOC exceeds your risk tolerance. And so you just have to want to keep that in mind as well. So I know that was a ton of information in a really short period of time. I could talk about SOCs all day long. If there's any questions that you have or any additional information that you want, make sure to throw it in the chat. I'll definitely get back to you on those things. We also have several webinars and learning materials about SOCs that I'd be happy to share with you. This is some key takeaways from today. This slide will be in your deck at the end of the presentation. But thank you guys so much and enjoy the rest of your boot camp. And I'll hand it back to Jessie.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. For a deeper dive into this topic, we encourage you to check out our on-demand webinar session covering how to read and review a vendor SOC report, a report walkthrough. We now have Hillary Dewhurst, Endminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, who will discuss managing AI risk with third-party risk management. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, so in this session, we are talking all about artificial intelligence, or AI as it's more commonly known. And we're going to really just talk a little bit about what it actually is and the risks associated with it. We're also going to talk about how we need to identify those vendor AI risks in our programs and how to update our framework to include that risk. Okay, we know AI is everywhere. We hear it all the time, but because this session is meant to be really informative, let's start off with the basic question. What is artificial intelligence? Now, it's basically a branch of computer science that's really been built to create systems that can do all sorts of tasks that could previously only be done with human intelligence. This is everything from recognizing images and speech to making decisions and even translating languages. Now, AI and automation both involve machines doing tasks that people used to do, but they are actually really different. Automation means that the machine is following a rule that has been put in the system. But artificial intelligence means that the machine can learn and change using data. All right, it's important to understand that AI basically comes in two flavors. We have what's called narrow or weak AI and general or strong AI. Now, starting with the weak AI, it doesn't mean that it's weak. It means that these systems are designed for very specific tasks, and those tasks have limited constraints. So they can't learn or understand beyond their function, but they're still really powerful and they're used in many applications. On the other hand, we have general or strong AI. And this refers to AI that can understand and learn and apply knowledge across various tasks at a level that's pretty much equal to humans. Now, right now, it's mostly a theoretical concept. Really, there's not a lot of existing examples for now. Okay, so in the AI space, there's a lot of terms and concepts to know, but let's go through some of the basic ones. We have machine learning, which is a basic technique that takes a lot of data and starts to train the AI model. They learn to recognize patterns in the data and then make predictions based on those patterns. As a subset of machine learning, we have what's deep learning. So it's using many layers and many patterns, and it's creating more complicated learning. So this technique of deep learning is really effective when we're doing things like image and speech recognition. We also have something called artificial neural networks, which is actually inspired by the human brain. And these systems can learn and gradually enhance their performance because they can identify patterns and make informed decisions. Okay, so we have natural language processing. This is all your Siris and Alexas, that sit behind chatbots and digital assistants. And these systems learn to understand and interpret and generate human language. We have computer vision, which are the systems that can recognize visual data. So these are things we do: image editing, facial recognition, self-driving cars. We also have generative AI, which is absolutely everywhere. I'm sure you've seen all the goofy images. Like, this is like your chat GPT, where a user gives a prompt and then the system generates a kooky image or text or even like a whole college paper. It's using those artificial neural networks to identify patterns and structures within existing data to create new data. So putting that in context, AI is already really prevalent in both our personal and business lives. If you're using a smartphone, if you're using a digital assistant like Siri or Alexa, even your Google Maps, the background algorithms of your social media, things like ChatGPT, and even your alerts on your smartwatch for your health and wellness. In business, we're seeing it a lot in banking for fraud detection, risk modeling. Of course, we've all come across one of those chatbots for customer service. There's lots of market analysts and trading that's happening, and security, facial recognition and biometrics. A lot of businesses are using those as well. Of course, there's inventory management and logistics and transportation that are all fully engaged with AI applications today. Okay, so it's really clear at this point that AI is everywhere. It's really powerful and interesting technology, but it's not without significant risks. And to be honest, it's so new that we don't even understand all the risks and potential challenges we may face. But two risks that people are very clear about right now are data security and privacy risk and compliance risk. And that's because the data can be stolen or breached, just like any other electronic system. That data can be exploited or used in a way which it was never intended to be used. The data can also be de-anonymized by accident, which is a huge problem. But then there's a variety of compliance risks, such as regulatory compliance, but there's also the potential to infringe on copyright. There's something called model drift and monitoring, which means what we were training the model to do never happened and it started doing something else wacky. And then there's audibility and accounting, right? Can we articulate and defend all the decisions that are being made by this computer system? So we have to think about the regulatory environment. So let's start with the United States. We had the President Biden's executive order on AI last year, and it's really kind of a high level of view that's talking about safety and security, but it's also about worker support, right? How do we keep from losing jobs? And civil rights might include like AI bias and how the federal government will use AI. There's multiple states that are implementing or drafting now specific AI laws that really focus on data privacy, accountability, and fairness. And in California, they actually have a law that limits the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. The EU, on the other hand, just passed in March of this year the AI Act, which is very thorough and probably sets a strong foundation and model for regulations to come worldwide. It's very specific about what is an AI system. It uses a risk-based approach, and it has a strong emphasis on transparency and accountability. So that means if you're the user, you get notified if you're interfacing with a chat bot, not a real person, or those crazy images, they have to be labeled as AI. It also thinks about the environment because generating all this information and constantly remodeling this data takes a tremendous amount of energy, and it prohibits specific types of AI altogether. Now, the AI Act is significant because if your organization deploys products or services that involve AI, whether you developed it or not, the European AI Act applies to you. Now, with that, we're going to take our first poll. Jesse?
The next poll question is, my organization is currently utilizing vendor products or services developed with or using AI technology. Yes, no, or not sure. Hillary, we have another question from the audience that we can answer.
Okay, let's do it.
Can you tell us why we should treat AI differently from other technology products or services we may use?
So this is a really great question. As AI has become more prevalent, a lot of people just say, well, it's just technology, right? We'll just simplify it. It's just technology. And the truth of the matter is that, yes, while AI is technology, it's basically data science, as we've been discussing, it has risks that don't exist with other technology systems. Like some of the ethical and moral considerations aren't always something we think about with our cloud service providers. Some of the issues that can occur regarding that model drift or sort of these AI hallucinations that can really mess things up, they don't exist with other technology. So it's really important that we, yes, look at it as technology, but also realize and recognize those additional risks and really make sure that we are articulating them and mitigating them appropriately. So I hope that helps.
Okay, the results are in. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you'll find how to identify, assess, and mitigate vendor artificial intelligence risk ebook available for download. Be sure to take a look. Back to you, Hillary.
Okay, so let's go through some of the specific risks that exist in AI. And it's important to understand that some of these risks are going to feel pretty familiar, right? If you're doing third-party risk management, you might already be familiar with data security as a risk. But what's important about AI is that these systems require an immense amount of data to operate. And often that data is what we would call PII. So of course, if we're not protecting that data, we're to be subject to cyber attacks or breaches. But one of the things that's most interesting about AI systems and the extra data security risk is that a compromised system can be used to maliciously carry out more attacks or leak information. There's lots of compliance concerns. Of course, all the laws and rules apply. And how this data is being used, it has to meet the permissible use law. So if there's discrepancies in the rules across jurisdictions, like one system is not compliant to multiple state laws, it can be a really big issue. So we need to keep our eyes on that. Of course, there's operational considerations. Any disruption or error could really cause big problems. But there's also a worry that over-dependence on AI might really start to limit an employee's critical thinking abilities. So, we're so used to everything being on autopilot, we don't know what to do in case of an emergency. Of course, there's reputation and brand issues. So if you have bad AI, inaccurate or ineffective customer information, so you get on the little chatbot, and I'm sure we've all had this, it just can't answer your question, it's not a very good brand experience. And overdependence on AI really starts removing what we call the human factor from those customer interactions. And that sometimes means rework, poor issue resolution, and ultimately distrust in the organization. Now, of course, there are some unique risks when it comes to AI, maybe some that we're not so familiar with. A big one is explicability and transparency. So, of course, we're using all this data to train these models to learn and make decisions, but if we can't explain exactly how that happens, it can create a lot of issues. It also can create very real legal risks in regulated industries where business decisions need to be auditable. We also have intellectual property risk, right? So not only can these AI models sometimes inadvertently reveal trade secrets or confidential information. But we also have the question of who owns the product once it's generated. Who owns that cookie image or that generated song or content? Furthermore, we have bias and fairness concerns. Now, these are pretty big because if decisions are made by a biased AI model, things like hiring or loan approvals can be unjustly disadvantaging certain groups, right? So there's legal and compliance concerns there. But also, if there's bias, it can really undermine the effectiveness of the model and really hinder user acceptance. Now, the big one that everyone likes to talk about is the moral and ethical considerations of AI, right? Sometimes AI systems might have unintended outcomes, and these outcomes can create really moral and ethical situations. So one might be, we use AI automation and it leads to a lot of job loss or economic disruption. What about a self-driving car that has to choose between the safety of the passenger and a pedestrian? Surveillance issues are a big one. And then, of course, those racial, gender, or socioeconomic biases can really potentially harm marginalized groups. Okay, so with all of this AI out there, chances are really good that your organization is already engaged with vendors who are delivering products and services that have AI associated with them. Either they're the product themselves or it's involved in the product. And there's probably a really good chance that you are not necessarily, or your third-party risk management program is not necessarily really built to identify and assess those AI risks right now. And if that is the case, can't feel bad about it because a lot of people are in the same boat. But even so, we need to act with a sense of urgency so that we can really start identifying these risks, assessing them, and mitigating them. So right now, if you have nothing, a really good way to get started is to just create a very short vendor questionnaire that you can send out to your vendors to get that information if they're using AI. So there's 3 questions that can provide a lot of information. The first one is AI technology an existing component of or has been used in the research, development, or production of any of your products and services? And if yes, tell us about it. If there are any plans to incorporate AI into your products, services, operations in the future? If yes, in what capacity? And most importantly, do you have any policies on employee use of AI? Do you expressly allow or forbid the use of any AI systems for employee work? So can they use ChatGPT, for example? If yes, provide the details. We want to put this little questionnaire together, start with our critical and high-risk vendors, and work our way down the list. Okay, so that little vendor risk questionnaire is a good place to get started, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to be enough because we have to start thinking about how we're going to integrate AI into our third-party risk management framework in general. So what do we need to consider here? Well, first of all, we have to think about adding some AI-related questions into our inherent risk assessments. We also, of course, need to get our vendor due diligence questionnaires updated to address AI. We have to work with those subject matter experts to figure out what kind of documentation we're actually going to request as evidence of AI controls. And we have to identify who that subject matter expert is. Of course, we have to think about contracts, how it can be factored into vendor performance monitoring and management, risk monitoring. We probably have to update some of our governance documentation. And of course, we have to educate and collaborate with our stakeholders. But of course, because of the scope and breadth of AI risk, it's also going to probably present some challenges as you're moving forward. And some of those challenges may be that your internal stakeholders, so your vendor owners or product managers, they just might not know enough about the AI in the product or service, how it works, how it operates, which can sometimes impact the accuracy of your inherent risk assessment, right? They don't know how to answer the question. There's vendors that are providing products and services using AI that's already been built in or designed by another vendor, so our fourth parties. And our vendors may not have sufficient risk management processes. Maybe their contracts aren't really addressing that AI or other things that can amplify that risk. Finally, during due diligence, the effective review of AI is going to be dependent on having the right subject matter expert. You may not have one in-house, which means you might have to get that resource externally. The other issue is that your existing contract templates may not address AI risk at all. Another thing to really consider is that AI models can learn from bad data, right? Meaning the problems get bigger and they keep getting bigger. It's important to ensure that there's high quality data to begin with, so who's testing and reviewing that data, and that there's frequent model retraining and monitoring. So this might mean that for products and services that have AI risk, you're going to have a shorter interval between performance reviews and risk monitoring. Okay, we've talked about subject matter experts, and we really want to hammer on this point because for most of us, we usually have a good group of folks that we depend on for cybersecurity, compliance, finance, etc. But this is a new risk. It requires a different skill set. And we really do need these folks to help us update our inherent risk questionnaires, figure out what we're going to ask the vendors in those due diligence questionnaires, and what kind of documentation that we need to request and collect. We also need some guidance about how to perform risk management and should control assessments be different here. What kind of issues might come up and who would remediate those issues. But we just need really qualified people to just consult with us to get the risk management part of this right throughout our whole framework. Now, when we talk about subject matter experts, we all know that they need to be qualified, right? It just can't be anyone. It's generally someone who has that practical experience, and preferably they have credentials or certifications in their risk domain. The problem is that AI is still really new, and actually there's not a lot of well-established certifications or credentials out there for AI right now. So it doesn't matter if you have someone internally or you're looking for an outside resource. At a minimum, they should really have strong background and experience with data science. And there's two credentials or certifications that you could look for. One is a CDSP certification, which is data science, programming, machine learning, and data visualization. The other one is called an Open CDS certification, which covers data science, algorithms, practical applications, and the like. So let's jump to contracts. Of course, we need to get those contract templates updated, or we need to make sure this information is integrated into the contracts. And don't be surprised if your legal team might ask you for some suggestions. There are a lot of things to consider, but here's some minimums we want to make sure we address or include in those contracts. The first one is disclosure of any AI, whether it's the development or it's the product or service. We want to make sure that we clearly define what we mean by AI, and we want to have some very clear terms about performance and accuracy. We also want a heavy emphasis on data security and privacy, and make sure that the vendor is telling us how they are going to protect user data within the AI system. We also want to include very clear information about explainability and transparency, right? So we need to be able to look at how the model works, how it makes decisions. We want to get documentation on that, and we also always want to have access to training data. We need to address how intellectual property will be treated, and we need to require the vendor to adhere to ethical guidelines when developing and deploying AI. We also always want to include a right to audit, so that you can look at the vendor's processes, data handling, and compliance to make sure that they're meeting all the expectations. Now, we're going to take a break for another poll. Jessie?
And we are to our last poll question of the day. And that question is, My organization has an internal policy regarding employee use of AI. Yes, it's in development. No, or not sure. Hillary, a question has come in from the audience that we can answer.
Okay.
Does the FCC consider AI a communication channel?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. So here's what I know or I understand. So the FCC does not consider AI a communications channel except for in two instances, which I believe are those AI-generated robocalls, and that requires that there's additional consent from the person receiving the call. There's also, I believe, and this is very topical right now, rules that would require any political advertising that's AI-generated so that that is disclosed, and that would be in the cases of TV and radio ads. So that's what I know is going on right now. I would definitely watch this space because AI is evolving and all of the regulators are trying to play their part, but the FCC in particular has identified robocalls and political ads under that communications channel designation. So I hope that is helpful.
On your screen now, you can see those results for the final poll. Thank you everyone for answering the question. Before we move on, please be aware that our artificial intelligence sample vendor questionnaire template is in the related content widget. You'll want to download this template to keep on hand. I'll pass it back to you, Hillary.
Okay, so we talked a lot about the framework today and what we need to do to get everything up to snuff from a third-party risk management perspective. But unless you work for a technology company, chances are pretty good that your entire organization is trying to figure it all out. So one of my best recommendations I can make today is work with your risk committee or your designated AI risk management team. We want to really talk about who are the internal AI subject matter experts, right? We need to make sure that we have good resources available. We also need to understand what the internal governance structure and requirements are going to be at our organization. So how do we compare internally to what we might be asking of our vendors, right? They should be pretty on par with each other. We also want to know what the organization's position is on employees using web-enabled AI tools, right? Or other tools that might be able to sidestep your third-party risk management process. Very important. We also want to ask about what plans there are for employee education regarding AI risk, because we know that more educated employees are going to have a better risk outcome. And one of the biggest questions is, how can we all work together to really leverage these resources and improve risk management overall? All right, so let's wrap up our session with some key takeaways. The very first thing, most important, is get educated. Read everything you get your hands on. As a third-party risk management professional, you will add real value to your organization if you're able to articulate and identify these risks, especially within your vendor products and services. Pay attention to that regulatory space. It's changing every day. Read the EU AI Act. It's actually very interesting and can give you a pretty good heads up about what might be coming in the future. Good place to start is getting that simple vendor questionnaire out to your vendors just to understand where AI exists in your existing products and services. And once you do that, remember, you're going to have to update your whole framework, but don't get discouraged. It is going to come with some unique challenges. But having the right subject matter expert should alleviate some of the stress. So it's just really important to work with your organization to figure out who that person or people, who the people will be. Make sure you don't forget about your contract templates, to make sure that standards and terms are updated and that specific AI information is integrated into those contracts. And again, partner with your risk committee to make sure that you have better AI risk management outcomes for everyone. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Thank you, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our second day of boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Lisa and Hillary, for their time in sharing important information on cybersecurity posture, business continuity and disaster recovery, SOC reports, and AI risk. Tomorrow, on the third and final day of the boot camp, we'll discuss vendor financial health in today's business climate, and Christine Kitamura, VinMinder's Senior Content Manager of Education, will share regulatory requirements and expectations in third-party risk management. After a quick break, Hillary Dewhurst will be back to discuss top third-party risk management program metrics and reports, and then Christine Kitamura will join us again to wrap up the bootcamp with understanding vendor exit strategies and third-party risk management closure. Let's now go ahead and answer some questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, this next question will come to you. Should we only require a BCP review for critical or high-risk vendors?
Thanks, Jessie. So I think it really actually depends more on what is that vendor needed for. So critical and high risk is part of the equation, but when we're talking about business continuity, we're talking about availability. So really, you want to ask yourself, can I continue to operate without this vendor? Is them being available critical to me to operate? And if the answer is yes, then you need to do a business continuity review and a disaster recovery review. And I say that because it's not that every critical vendor needs a business continuity, and it's not that every non-critical vendor doesn't. Availability really plays into it. And that oftentimes equates to criticality. But I think it's important to make sure you're asking yourself the right questions.
Great. Hillary, this next question is for you.
Okay.
How do we work with a vendor that uses their own AI models and are a critical vendor unwilling to reveal their LLM or training data, citing IP reasons with their fourth party?
Okay, so this is a fairly complex question, and I can make some assumptions. One, based on the fact that they're critical, there should have been due diligence, or if you're in the process of going through due diligence, it's really important to make sure that you have non-disclosure agreements. And if you have to do multi-party non-disclosure to cover those fourth parties, that is recommended. Certainly your vendor should understand your need to validate both, training models, et cetera, as part of your responsibility to your organization and your customers. And if you're in a regulated industry, certainly meeting those higher standards. So I would basically start with the NDA, think if you can negotiate through that. If they are still unwilling, I would put the pressure back on them to say, how do you suggest that we validate these things? Because we have to validate them. Again, because they're a critical vendor, you may be able to escalate that, maybe get senior people from your organization involved in talking to senior people from their organization, just so that everybody really understands the serious and urgent nature of making sure that you can validate those. Again, I don't have all the details, but I hope those suggestions are helpful to move forward.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Lisa, we'll come back to you for this next question. For security testing, what is the baseline frequency for testing?
Sure. So for things like penetration testing, we recommend at least annually. Same thing with like application testing. For things like vulnerability scanning or those internal tests that you're doing more regularly, really we like to see that daily, but best practice I think says monthly. So it really just depends on which testing you're looking at, and I think that's part of why it's important to understand what you're looking for, because every type of testing has a kind of a different best practice. But for the most part, for those larger tests that are more at the higher level, annually is what we're generally looking for.
Great. And Hillary, back to you for this next question.
Okay.
We have a vendor who is incorporating a chatbot for customer service, but cannot provide a separate AI governance policy. Would you consider this a big problem?
A big problem, I'm not sure, depends on, the risk associated with that vendor, but I would say that if the chatbot is going to be interfacing with your customers, then yeah, that's a fairly serious issue. Like I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of organizations are moving faster than their governance structures around AI, and I think that it's reasonable to request that they develop one and make that a time-bound thing, but also make sure that you're very clear about what that policy should include, like training for their employees and monitoring of models, et cetera. Again, chatbots have a lot of reputational considerations because, if they're talking to your customers, it's not a good thing if they're not effective or they're giving the wrong information. But we also want to make sure that that vendor, their organization, is taking that really seriously and looking at those AI risks in isolation, not in isolation, but as the next level when they're thinking about governance. So yes, I think it's a problem. I would ask for it, see if you can work with your vendor to get one. I hope that's helpful.
Right. Lisa, we have time for one more quick question. And that is, can we request to be part of a vendor's testing?
Great question. And absolutely, you can request. A lot of vendors will say no in certain scenarios. I think, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about contract language and being proactive. I think for business continuity and disaster recovery testing, it's so important that you play a role in that in some way, shape, or form when you're doing your business continuity and disaster recovery testing, or when they're doing theirs, that you are a part of understanding the results, especially if they're a critical application or vendor to you, or when it comes to availability. You should definitely ask. And a lot of, I think, larger vendors have the ability to pull you into their testing in some way, shape, or form. Don't be surprised if some say no, though. But I do think it's a good idea to always ask.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Lisa and Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as cybersecurity, business continuity and disaster recovery, SOC reports, AI risk, and more. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. Be sure to check out our webinars page to find several standalone sessions on today's topics. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 2 of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Hillary and Lisa for their time and content. On behalf of Minder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow for the 3rd and final day of the bootcamp.